Hello and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. This is Jill Bodensteiner, Director of Athletics at St. Joseph's University. As leaders, it's really important that we're clear regarding our goals and our vision and how those integrate into the greater university goals. We also need to collectively create a strategy and a culture that are going to help us reach our goals. This is an evolving exercise that requires an openness to continuous improvement. That's why I follow the One Question Leadership Podcast, because I love learning as much as I possibly can from my colleagues that helps me be the best that I can be. So my message for the day, keep learning, keep leading.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown, and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at 1Q Leadership. Our guest today is Joe Karlgaard. Joe, at some point, Joe, you were the athletic director at Rice for I think 10 years, athletic director at Oberlin for 6 years, spent roughly 25 years in college athletics, left college athletics to become the CEO of GSV Summit, and now you serve as an advisor for GSV, which stands for Global Silicon Valley Ventures or something like that. Correct me where I made a mistake and help me out.
No, you pretty much got it right. GSV is Global Silicon Valley. It's a platform that includes a venture fund. GSV Ventures includes the Summit, which is a conference business, which you're right. Last summer, I left to run that conference business. And then there's a third side, GSV Holdings, which is where I am now as an advisor.
Okay. So the Summit. Now, I did some research trying to figure out exactly what this thing was that Joe got himself involved with, right? It looked like it was an event that showcases and supports innovation in education delivery. I feel like that's not necessarily fully the scope of what it was or what it is.
So it's the world's largest and best convening of really three groups or four groups. It's founders of ed tech companies.
Okay.
It's investors in those companies, and it's buyers. So buyers could be anybody looking for an edge in ed tech. It could be a K-12 superintendent. It could be a college or university provost, dean, president, or it could be a chief learning officer at a major corporation. So, our mantra at GSV has been pre-K to gray. We invest in ed tech and innovation in the pre-K to gray space, which, entails everything from teaching little kids how to read to platforms like Masterclass, where you're learning for the sake of learning, perhaps even after you've retired from your day-to-day.
Yeah, interesting. And now you're an advisor. So what I wonder is you talk about working in college athletics so long, and this is what you know. Although you understand leadership, you understand building projects and putting things together and leading people in a certain direction. What interested you about originally being the CEO of GSV Summit?
Yeah, so I had a conversation in the spring of 2023 with a guy named Michael Moe, and Michael was a former college athlete. He's actually on the National Football Foundation board. And Michael's dad is a guy named Tom Moe, and Tom had been the athletic director at the University of Minnesota in the early 2000s, sort of right after their academic scandal. He came in, he'd been a lawyer in Minneapolis for many, many years and came in to kind of steady the ship. And so the conversation I was having with Michael was around, what are the opportunities outside of college athletics that somebody who's built a career inside this ecosystem, where would you see them? You know a little bit about what an AD does because your dad did it. Yet you have this platform at GSV where you get to see, kind of where education is headed. And so we had a discussion. They were looking for their first CEO to run their conference business. And GSV does, the kind of the Super Bowl of their conferences is the ASU GSV Summit, which takes place in April every year in San Diego. But they also have done conferences in India. We did one in Nashville last year. And they're really looking to expand their presence globally. And so he needed somebody who had experience, running large events, selling tickets, sponsorships, overseeing marketing and communications. And so that was sort of the original job, which I came in to do, last summer, and, stayed on the summit side through this year's ASU GSV Summit in April in San Diego, and then transitioned over into this advisor role with GSV Holdings.
Would you consider the past summit this April, like, was there the Joe Karlgaard influence, or were you just helping the machine stay on course, which it had already done? Like, tell me about how you evaluated your role there.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I mean, it started over 15 years ago as a small convening on the Arizona State campus of about 300 people. And it's grown into an event now that attracts over 8,000 people from 130 plus countries. We added something we called the Air Show, which is the AI revolution in education, which was an expo, a convening of all these different startup companies that were able to show educators in the Southern California area and anybody who wanted to come what they're doing and what they're working on, and how AI will be influential in education, both today and into the future. And I mean, it is the ASU GSV Summit and GSV Summit is a speeding locomotive. I mean, it is an unbelievable organization that I think showcases the leading edge of education and innovation. As I said before, all the way from little kids through people who are into continuing education. So I came in and really, tried to do what I could to help organize the group to try to help launch this expo, the Air Show that we called it, this last April, and to perhaps lend a little bit different lens into things. Coming from college athletics, not being somebody who was part of that system, I had a little bit different take on maybe how we did some things. And so, I believe I added some value, but, it was a really well-run machine before I ever got there.
Was there overlap? And did you see where the experience in bringing in revenue in terms of sponsorships and managing tickets and data and all that stuff fit?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The revenues for the summit really are sponsorships and registrations. For lack of a better word, it's ticket sales, right? And so, that comprises the lion's share of how the organization makes money. And so it's a little bit different than what you're coming from in college athletics, particularly from a place like Rice, where you've got an institutional subsidy, you've got conference media revenues, you've got NCAA tournament units, in addition to sponsorships and ticket sales. And so I would say that, the typical college athletic revenue portfolio is a little more diversified than maybe what we had at GSV Summit. But I know, moving into the future, we'll look for other ways to potentially enhance, revenues to the summit. And try to make it an even bigger and better event.
Right. Then you move over. Well, I'd say one thing about that. One thing we did working with Coach Taff in the AFCA, he always wanted to keep membership low because he wanted high school coaches to be able to afford to come. Right. Near the end of his tenure, we raised the price on the college coaches and FBS, but high school coaches, he kept it relatively low. Then we introduced a convention fee. So membership was $60, convention fee was $10. Like, it was real low for 8,000 coaches coming. You weren't going to support the whole association at $60 a pop. So then what he did was he made sure the exhibit hall was a big revenue driver, for the convention, and put the registration when you showed up to convention in the back of the exhibit hall. So it was guaranteed traffic to the exhibitors, so people would want to exhibit there. And then we started bringing in sponsors, and then he created a foundation to help the education. It was a whole bunch of things, but to your point, trying to vary the revenue streams there was always a struggle at the AFCA. You moved over to a different position now, and offline you said something about helping entrepreneurs or something along the lines as an advisor for Global Silicon Valley, not necessarily the event, but the core organization, I guess. Tell me a little bit about that in terms of what you do now.
Yeah. So my I'd say what I'm doing now with GSV probably taps a little bit more into the things that I enjoyed as an athletics director. I mean, one of the
Okay.
things that I always thought was so much fun was, identifying talent and then trying to help shape, their future direction. Giving, people like we were talking about Brian Blair, I'm very proud of the fact that we had on the senior staff at Rice at the same time, 3 future Division I athletic directors, and Tanner Gardner, who's now just started at Pepperdine, and Brian Mann, who's been at William and Mary, and Brian Blair, who's blowing it up at Toledo.
Yep.
Finding those folks and then giving them opportunities to grow and expand their skill sets, and hopefully parlay that into success down the road, whether that was at Rice or some other place. I was always happy to do that, and I always found that to be one of the most rewarding parts of being an athletics director. And so now I'm in a role where I can do that with startups, and my bent is a little bit more towards. In fact, I'm involved with a startup right now that crosses over into the high school and college athletics space. And there's 2 founders. They're brothers-in-law. One has no background in sports whatsoever, but has already founded and sold an ed tech company. The other has a background in sports, but doesn't have any of that other stuff. And so, being able to work with those guys on a daily basis and help them think about the business and about, particularly in the college space, about how they might apply the business in the college space. Those are the sorts of things that remind me of what I enjoyed so much about being an athletic director. And the more of that I can do, the more I'll feel fulfilled, and feel like I'm reaching my purpose, in my current line of work. And so that's been an enjoyable transition for me. There's a couple other groups. I wouldn't call them technology groups, but really innovative solutions and startups that I'm also advising, and just finding that work really, really enjoyable.
There's an aspect of business that I learned while studying business recently, is that, if you start with the problem, your business may be a lot more successful, right? Figure out solutions for a problem that already exists instead of just creative ideas. I imagine the people that you work with have already identified problems that they're working on solving, and you're trying to help them figure out how to best solve that problem. Or are you in the minutia of business? Like, are you you mentioned people, so I imagine you're in the people business. But do you cross over into the minutia of funding and finances and all those types of things that entrepreneurs deal with when they think they have a great idea or they have a great solution for a problem that exists in society?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, the folks that I'm working with are pretty well versed in how businesses are financed, and that is something that has been super rewarding since I left college athletics, is gaining a greater understanding of that. The different sources of capital for business, why a business might, prefer debt or private equity or venture funding, or why they may want to bootstrap their own business for a while.
Yeah.
Those have all been things that I've learned over the course of the last year that I didn't really know much about. But I would say, really, it's more about they perceive a problem out there, and they think they have a way to solve that problem, and they may not have it exactly right. And it's sort of that shaping and course correcting along the way that gets them to the ultimate product market fit, which is what you want. If you have that really tight fit between the product that you're offering and what the market demands, then you're going to have a successful business. And that's where the coaching and advising can be so much fun.
Okay. So you're learning a lot, not even just the financing side you just mentioned, but also the market for these various services or businesses and how they fit 4 layers away from what we consumers see and all those things. I think that's actually interesting, right? It's like education. Yeah.
It's super interesting. And it's I I get to flex and use my brain in a different way. I think when you are, when you're sort of on a traditional path, as I think I was in college athletics.
Yep.
I was a student athlete, and then I coached for a while, and then I sort of had this lower level administrative job, and then I worked my way up. I think your brain gets trained in a certain kind of linear way, and it's very, very difficult for you, particularly given the dynamics of change in college athletics, to kind of extract yourself from that and look at it from a different angle. And that's one of the cool things about what I do now is I'm not in the soup, on a day-to-day basis, like so many of my former colleagues are. And it just gives me the luxury of being able to look at it maybe a little more objectively and maybe from a different vantage point. And hopefully eventually, as I continue to work with startups, we'll help find ways to solve the larger problems that exist right now in college athletics.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you see where some of the new education that you have received over the last year or year and a half or however long it's been, do you see where some of it could fit when you talk about different ways of financing business or even looking at, so Kevin Blue always described college athletics as competing nonprofits, right?
Yeah.
Zero-sum game type situation.
Yep.
But then you also are bringing a whole bunch of money and you got to look at the bottom line and the way everybody else looks at college athletics as this, it's just big business here. So I wonder about I'm going to keep calling it the education you've received. And can you see how things could look a little different, or have you developed some kind of thought process? Because I know you think about college athletics all the time. You can't just lose it out of your brain after so many years. Tell me about your thoughts on that, the crossover that might be there. Yeah.
It's like learning a foreign language, right? Sometimes I dream in it. It just is, right? I can't, you can't consume news of any sort these days without college athletics being part of it, if you're a sports fan at all. And so, I continue to pay attention, and I continue to, because I work remotely, one of the things that I've wanted to do is just, to the extent possible, to stay in touch with former colleagues, to, I live in Minneapolis now. So, I regularly have lunch with Mark Coyle and Phil Eston, and, I've gotten to know the pro sport presidents in the Twin Cities, and, just trying to stay connected, with those folks as best I can. I think I've probably developed a greater tolerance for how for-profit companies can still be mission driven and can still deliver on, deliver a public good.
Yeah.
And I think, when you work in the nonprofit environment, and I use that phrase loosely because, there are many, many college athletic departments that, you look at their revenues and expenses, and their expenses only meet their revenues because they're spending extra dollars because they have it. But there are a bunch of schools out there that are turning profits. And I think as I think about, the way that college athletics could be financed in the future and the sharing of revenue with student athletes, I do think there are opportunities that probably were anathema to the whole industry 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that people will begin to wrap their heads around and, could provide some net benefit, a more efficient industry, and one that really recognizes the contributions of student athletes to the value that's being created. So I've changed, I think, from where I may have been 10 years ago on that.
Yeah. I think that the whole balance of that is, you try to not to be antithetical to what college athletics started off as, and try to look at it from the perspective of evolution of college athletics and not turning college athletics inside out. So I wonder, if you talk about business, how do you keep from, even with some of the people you work with, in terms of business, you want to focus on the things that either have the biggest profit margin or the things that bring the most revenue, and then you lower the expenses on those things so that the profit margin grows. Like how do you balance that when you're talking about people? Because you see how professional leagues do it, right? Somebody's an asset, like running backs in the NFL. It's like 4 years. That's all you really got as a running back. And then you're no longer profitable based on data from years past that says a running back after 4 or 5 years, legs go or something like that. So how do you balance that and keep people at the forefront, which is something you said is part of your purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the professional leagues, the NFL, for example, that you cite, I mean, that's
they don't hide it. I mean, it's what they are.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fixed ecosystem that where everybody's in competition with each other.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty easy to turn people into commodities in that kind of environment.
That's
I think.
True. You're right about that.
I think, in the businesses that, both GSV Summit, we certainly had competitors in GSV Summit. There's lots of ed tech conferences globally. We sort of thought and think that we're a little bit different than those others, but it's still not the same environment that you're talking about. So I think that, for me, you have to have the right people on your team, and you have to have people that value purpose ahead of profits, because you can have both. You can be profitable, but, and still have that purpose. But I think, all too often what ends up happening when you're in intense competition is that delivering value back to your shareholders or back to your owner is job one. And that leads to organizations that can lose their soul, even if they once had a greater purpose. At least in the short time that I've been outside of college athletics, I haven't encountered that. I find that, that we've kept the mission at the top of, every document that's shared, every conversation that we have. And you get the right people around the table who buy into that, and you can still make a lot of money. And, that's ultimately the goal.
Yeah, which it sounds like you're talking about are what I've learned is called agency problems, where, you got the customer, you got the shareholder, and it's like, which one are you trying to please the most?
Yeah, the prospect agent or principal agent problem.
Yeah, that's right there. Yeah. So then in college athletics, I imagine if college athletics goes the route of private funding, you probably will still have that problem at some institutions or some conferences or however it's going to be planned out. So it's really on the people, whether it be student athletes or whether it be people working at these institutions, to figure out how can you tell if this is it's like even like taking a job, right? How can you tell if this corporation I'm gonna go work for is really about serving who they say they want to serve, or are they just trying to make a dollar based on what the shareholders or the private equity firm comes in? It's really vetting people, again, back to people, right? Just determining where you want to go.
Yeah, I think it's about doing your due diligence. And I think the college sports ecosystem, at least at the FBS level, is, now 130 plus schools. Mm-hmm. I think with the House settlement, and the advent of NIL, I think, that separation between the top end and the bottom end is accelerating. And I think, you may end up with a group of schools in number that may look more like a standard American professional league, 30-ish, 35, something like that. It'll be interesting to see, and I don't have an answer for this, as to whether or not those institutions then look more like and feel more like, culturally more like NFL or NBA or Major League Baseball or hockey or soccer franchises.
Whatever they are. Yeah, super interesting. I wonder, think you just mentioned your coaching tree, right? Brian Mann, Brian Blair, Tanner just starting.
Yeah.
Do they call you and ask for advice on things? Like, have they approached challenges? I mean, obviously you want to figure out on your own, but we all have mentors. Like, do they call you and say, "Hey, Joe, look, have you ever had to deal with this, and how did you deal with it?" Have you gotten that kind of phone call?
I've gotten that phone call a couple of times. I mean, I think I have the kind of relationship with those guys and with others that I worked with, where sometimes I call them, and I would say just to initiate a conversation about what they're seeing. It's
Okay.
maybe less advice. I'm older than all those guys, so I can say it's appropriate for me to give you advice, but you haven't been in it long enough to give me advice yet. And I say that like half in jest, but I'll call them. I'll have a conversation with Brian Blair and say, how are you thinking about your collective post house, and just kind of open the door to see, if that spurs any ideas. Because I'm also having conversations with entrepreneurs in the ecosystem who may be able to come in and help solve some of these issues. So it's helpful for me in the role that I have now to be constantly in communication with people that I know in college athletics, to hear their feedback and hear their challenges, so that then I can help, people who are helping to try and solve those challenges get it right. So yeah, they do call me, but I call them just as often.
Yeah, which is extra interesting, right? To be in a position where you've helped them. I think we've talked a couple times on this podcast, and if I recall, one of the things that I think you wanted to get more of, but didn't get a lot of as you became tenured in the chair, is interaction with student athletes. And so now you work remote in Minnesota. You got to go to these campuses to see the other colleagues because they still get the interaction. Tell me about that, if it is missing part of, your career and the life situation.
I absolutely miss it. It's the best part. I remember the first time I met Jack Swarbrick was maybe 2015 or so. And, he was asking me about what the job at Rice was like. And, and I was telling him how busy I was. And he said, do you make time for the student athletes? And I said, oh, sure. I make time. And he said, no, do you schedule time to go to practice? He said, you need to put that on your calendar. And I remember that being just a kind of a wide-eyed moment for me early on in my time at Rice. And
he was only a couple years in the chair around that time, right?
Yeah.
He's coming with this wisdom, like, hey,
yeah. And so, I started being more deliberate about getting to practice.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward to last fall, because I'm fully remote and constantly craving, in-person environments, I text Mark Coyle and say, hey, are you available for lunch? And he says, yeah, sure. Why don't you come over to campus and we'll eat in the athletic dining room. So he invites me over, and it's this beautiful, training table environment.
Right.
So we get our food, we sit down, and we're having a conversation, and we keep getting interrupted by student athletes who are passing by Mark saying, hey, Mr. Coyle, so great to see you. Thanks for coming to our soccer match the other day. Or, hey, I look forward to, seeing you on the football trip this weekend. And I looked at Mark and I said, look, I know it's hard right now, but I said, you have no idea how great this is. Like, I only have a few months at that point. I only had a few months perspective on it, but that part of it, that's why most of us got into it in the first place. And I mean, there's no doubt I miss that. I try to, at least I get to some of my own kids' athletic events maybe a little more often than I did when I was an AD, but that's about the extent of my interaction with student athletes.
Yeah, that's a good thing, right? It's to be home, right? Be present with your own kids, right? That's always a benefit.
No
doubt. One more question about that, and then I want to ask some more questions about the entrepreneurs before we wrap. Thinking about the guys that came up under you, the other people who you were probably leading when you were at Rice, just thinking about that people development aspect, and what you said was entrepreneurship is a part of it now. Like, do you do anything in college athletics anymore, or are you all just global Silicon Valley advisor? Like, is there anything that you are involved in terms of, I don't know, some type of leadership type development thing or anything that you do?
I did some stuff for the minority football group.
Okay. Yeah.
Last month in May. Archie had reached out to me about getting involved in that, and I'd been doing that for a couple of years. So we did some mock interviews there. There's really no formal engagement that I have. I mean, I've I talked to whenever Tommy McClellan's got a question about something that I did or something that happened at Rice that he needs a deeper understanding of, he'll call, and I check in with him just to make sure he's doing okay every once in a while. And then obviously the people that I worked with at Rice.
Yeah.
So I try to stay in touch that way, but it's not, I don't have any formal, role
Formal
in college athletics
yeah.
right now.
Yeah, there's some things that like the NCAA Leadership Development does with their Pathways program, Leadership Institute, which I bet if they knew you were willing, they'd probably call you in a heartbeat like, hey, come talk to these administrators here. They all want to be ADs. That's hilarious.
As time goes on, my perspective matters less and less, Ty.
I don't know if that's true, especially because you're working with entrepreneurs, right? And
True.
You start talking about, there's two things I've been focusing on lately. One is storytelling, and the other one is entrepreneurship in terms of if everybody is owning the job and treating it like an entrepreneur, they can be creative in what they're doing. But I think everything we do in all aspects of our jobs and life is telling stories, whether it be numbers, whether it be, whatever, advertising, whater it be whatever we're doing, student athlete experience. Last question I ask you is the set of entrepreneurs you've worked with in the role, the role you're in now and how long you've been doing it. Do you see any common challenges? A friend of mine once told me that all issues in business come down to communication. And I've been trying to ask people if they believe that, if that's what they see, but that was just an example. But do you see any common challenges across entrepreneurs in terms of them trying to get their businesses off the ground and engage wherever they're trying to engage?
I think in a true startup environment, differentiating your product can be a challenge. It's a challenge across, probably across industries. I do think the communication aspect is big, particularly as you start to add people to your team. So one of the groups that I'm advising right now, has a few, there's the co-founders, and then they've got a few people that they've brought in who are working kind of on a contract basis. And, as the thing starts to grow, there's probably, 6 to 8 people who are working on it pseudo full time, and then another, 5 to 10 people who are working on it part time. Those communications start to arise, and we use Slack and we Zoom, and we try to do things because we're scattered all throughout the country to try and alleviate those things. But I think one piece of advice that I'd give to anybody who's in this space is try to make sure that whatever ideas or conversations that you have, that somewhere there's a pin put in that it's memorialized in some way, so that you didn't have a great idea or you didn't say something to somebody and there's no way to go back and retrieve that information. I think the better, as you grow in complexity, that becomes more and more critical, because the more people that you have involved, it just stands to reason that communication is going to get more and more difficult and becomes more and more necessary.
Do you see where stories I've heard about entrepreneurship is somebody or somebody's starts a company and then they grow and now they got a team and they have never really led people before. So now they got to figure out this leadership thing. Are the companies you work with at that point where the founders are trying to figure out how to be leaders in addition to the tactician, right? The tactician, the leader, the 50,000 foot, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that Michael Moe and I have talked about. What are the ways that we could think about, helping to provide the right coaching and advice to these brilliant founders who have great ideas but have no experience.
All right.
And oftentimes when you bring in outside investors, you create a board and those investors are part of that board and they're the ones giving the advice. But I think there's also a way for practitioners to be involved in that. So you're seeing this happening a little bit in some of the private equity firms that are engaging in sports. They're bringing on operating partners. So, Brian LaFemina, who worked for the Commanders and then was the chief business officer for LA28, is now an operating partner with Arctos. Like, he's an operator. He understands kind of how sports organizations work, and that can be really beneficial for some of your investors. So I do think that, it's easier when you're a first-time athletic director and you're learning on the fly and you've never done this before, because you're surrounded by other leaders on your campus who have done some variation of that before. It's much harder as an entrepreneur to get the right advice and coaching. And, you're also trying to move really, really fast. So to move at a pace that allows you to develop properly, that is absolutely a challenge, Ty.
A challenge. Well, because some entrepreneurs, at some point, you're not hands-on anymore, right? You're not making the thing that is the solution to whatever problem you found. You get further and further away from that, and you really have to be, like you said, somebody who knows how to run an operation, which is a big challenge, which they probably could find, like you said, value in Joe Karlgaard being a part of this coaching enterprise to help global Silicon Valley do its thing. Joe, this has been an excellent conversation. I'm really interested in the work you do, and I really appreciate you joining us here on the One Question Leadership Podcast.
Yeah, I appreciate you thinking about me, Ty, and I appreciate all the things that you've done to help tell the story of the great people who work in this industry.
Thank you very much. That was Joe Karlgaard. He's an advisor with Global Silicon Valley. And of course, I am Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.